So I think we should probably start. Thank you all for making it to Lugano. This was a little bit more traumatic than we all would have wished, I think, for various reasons. I'm sorry to say that my large group in Manchester, none of them have come apart from myself, because of the fears of being self-quarantined going back through Milan, which was one of the pieces of advice that the Minister of Health in the UK issued. And then when the single case in Lugano occurred of coronavirus, that caused a further problem, I think. We're going to, as you may have seen in your mails, we're putting this out on Zoom, so those of you people who haven't been able to make it hopefully can at least hear the talks, but it's not going to be possible for those online to ask questions because it's just too difficult technologically to achieve that. There is a chat system within Zoom, but it's difficult to run it at this stage. So those of you who are here have the benefit of asking questions and doing what we do at meetings, which is to talk to each other, but those online will find it difficult. This is our 9th Advances Against Aspergillosis meeting, and it's really a welcome on behalf of David Stevens and Bill Steinbach, who run the meeting with me, and for the last 3 occasions, Derry Brothers and her team at Hartley Taylor. We've also been joined by Cornelia Lasfeld, who's helped us with the scientific committee group, and we're also indebted to the rest of the scientific committee members for their contributions. And Cornelia's not made it, but partly because there are 2 cases in coronavirus in Innsbruck, but also because one of her family members has died, so she's also not been able to come. But that was a decision as much about a family issue as it is here. I'm going to, as you know, in addition to working in Manchester as a clinical academic, I also lead the GAFI, which is the Global Action Fund for Fungal Infections, and some of the data I'm going to present to you it relates to that and how big the problem of aspergillosis is. And there have been some substantial changes in this since over the last 2 years, which I think are worth focusing on. So our meetings before have started in San Francisco. In fact, there was a pre-meeting before that about cystic fibrosis and aspergillus, which Rick Moss and David Stevens ran, which produced a very important paper in that area. And then that was the genesis of all of these meetings. We've always had about 320 to 350 people participating. In one meeting, we had about 450 people attending. And there have been a lot of papers presented as a result of these meetings, which have enhanced the field. I should give credit to David Stevens, who's been very supportive of this and trying to encourage people to write papers, which can be summary papers and papers that wouldn't get written about topics which, tend not to get aired very much. And actually, they have, in many cases, been an important part of the contribution. And there have also been 1,400 some abstracts presented at the meeting. So that's a big body of work which has also been presented, which we think is also very valuable. Last time I presented this slide, slightly similar, different format, very similar. And the chronic and allergic aspergillosis cases really haven't changed at all. We don't have a better estimate for the number of these patients than we currently have. And you can see there's a pretty wide range in those numbers, but they are in the millions. But what has changed, and I'll show you why, is that we think there's much greater number of invasive aspergillosis cases than we previously had appreciated. And that's for several reasons. The last figure, about 5 years ago, we thought the figure was around 200 to 250,000. When I last presented, it was 300,000. And now I think it's probably more than 750,000, although it's difficult to be quite sure. And there are difficulties in establishing the diagnosis. And this is the primary reason why. So Emily, who was going to come to the meeting but isn't here, and Charlie, who I don't have a picture of, both medical students in Manchester, and Jürgen Vespo, who's a leader in COPD, and I worked on how many patients are there with invasive aspergillosis complicating COPD. So the first thing was how many patients are there with COPD, and the last estimate in the world was about 10 years ago and was about 300 million. We looked at the gold stage 2 to 4, which is the sort of slightly more severe end of the spectrum, and actually there are probably over 500 million people with COPD in the world. So really quite a lot more than we thought. And then patients with COPD go into hospital quite a bit. Some of them go in repetitively, and the number who are admitted to hospital is around, we think per year, number of people admitted, not admissions, people, is over 57 million people. It's a lot of people admitted to hospital with their COPD. And there are two estimates of invasive aspergillosis in that context, one from Spain, which Jesus Guinea did, and another one from southern China. And one of them is at 1.3%, and the other is at 3.9% of hospitalizations. And that gives you a figure of 750,000 patients with invasive aspergillosis, or 2.2 million. And if you look at the mortality figures attached to that, they're very large mortality rates as well. So the figure that I've suggested of 850,000 is using the lower estimate, even downgrading this estimate slightly. And this is, invasive aspergillosis in this context is a difficult diagnosis at the moment, and we haven't really addressed it properly. So when you turn that into a country burden and a global burden, this is a work that we've been doing with Gafi in the Latin America, 18 countries, and it's a little bit complicated to follow, but if you look at where the red arrows are, you can see in invasive aspergillosis and leukemia about 4,700. We assume 4% of people who die of AIDS have invasive aspergillosis, so that's 1,300 in Latin America. And then you've got lung cancer cases, which is about 2.6%, so that's 2,200 cases. And then you've got COPD and these two different estimates. And this completely dwarfs all of the other cases of all the other incidence rates of invasive aspergillosis. And those numbers don't include transplants, so lung transplants, liver transplants, etc. It doesn't include liver failure, where the rate is about 4%. It doesn't include other cancers. It's not very common in other cancers, but it does occur. Are people on immunosuppressive therapy, or, importantly, medical ICU, where the rate is between 2 and 5% of patients coming into medical ICU, some of them with COPD, so that there's a duplication of those numbers. So, in fact, the number, it really may be really a lot of people with this disease. Last year, we published with Mohammed Hedati from Iran the first estimate of DALYs in invasive aspergillosis. This hasn't been done before. And one of the issues around funding in our area is that the Gates Foundation is very interested in funding technological solutions to problems, but if you don't have a DALY, you don't enter their system. And for fungal diseases, there are very few DALYs presented, and so there's a real need to develop more DALYs, QALYs, and all of these other measures of life, years of life lost, and so on. And another medical student, Lottie, who also isn't here, she and I and Matthew Burton at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have estimated how many patients there are with fungal keratitis. We think there's about 1 million, but in fact, if you take the culture negative cases, it's probably about 1.4 million. And something like 40% of these are Aspergillus. So that's a lot of people, and many of these people go blind as a result of their ocular disease. And perhaps one of the largest groups of patients with aspergillosis is actually patients with toenail infections, because somewhere between 0.5 and 3% of all toenail cases are Aspergillus, and that's about 10 million people. So this is also quite a bigger problem than we had perceived. It's much smaller than dermatophyte, of course, but it's still, from an Aspergillus perspective, quite a big problem. And this is an area that's received almost zero attention in the literature. So today is World Aspergillosis Day, My colleagues in Manchester, Helen Findon and Graham Atherton, have been very active with this, and this has been supported by a number of individuals and patients, and also Pfizer have given us a little bit of support in the UK to try and disseminate information about that. And I'd be grateful if those of you who are interested in this could tweet this and have a look at the website. It's important, and one of the messages here is that 1 in 300 people have aspergillosis, and there's not enough recognition of the morbidity attached to these problems across the world. We need to do a much better job of informing people in primary care about their condition and generally raising the awareness of aspergillosis, as well as doing the research which is needed. So there's a Twitter handle for the meeting, 9th AAM, and then there's a Twitter handle for World Aspergillosis Day for those of you who do Twitter, and those would be helpful if you want to magnify the discussions which we're going to have at the meeting here today. So last meeting, I presented 5 aspirational targets for aspergillosis, which we should achieve over the next 10 years. It was 12 years then, and I just want to review those. So the first was that we can improve survival from invasive aspergillosis. And at the moment, we're probably running at under 50%, even if we make a diagnosis and treat. This is a disease which is almost always fatal undiagnosed, and the only exceptions are patients who have a reversal of their immunosuppression. And we really haven't yet achieved this. Now, the new drugs coming through may achieve it, but there are other things to be done in order to try to achieve improved outcomes. The second was about the science and understanding the disease. So we need to understand more about the biology, more about the immunological interactions, and more about the genetic basis of aspergillosis. And there has been really quite a lot of improvements, particularly in the pathogenesis of invasive aspergillosis. And so there is some definite movement forward in this area, which is really good. There's more to do, particularly, I think, in the chronic and allergic aspergillosis cases, but also the genetics are not yet well established, I think, and we need to understand that better. So, and then there's a target related to diagnostics. Most countries don't have diagnostics. Clearly the high-income countries tend to. They have galactomannan, antibodies, CT scanners, bronchoscopy, and so on. But there's a large number of countries around the world which don't have these tests. And now we have a really a selection of excellent point-of-care tests, both for antibody and antigen. And we also have a much greater understanding of how to use those tests. And so this is something that we need to do the dissemination and get these tests out to many people. That's very important. It isn't good enough to say we need a new test alone. We need to get the ones we have out. We do need new antifungal drugs. As you realize, one of the problems is patients dying because the drugs aren't effective enough, but we've also got resistance issues. We also have drug interaction issues, deliverability issues, bioavailability issues. And so there are several drugs in development, and this is very welcome. None of them have yet made it through. I'm hopeful that 3 or 4 of these will make it through for aspergillosis, but we have yet to see, I think. It would be great to have a vaccine, particularly for invasive disease, although also switching off fungal asthma, which immunologically might be possible, would also be very valuable, I think. And that has not been achieved, and I haven't seen any real progress in this area over the last 2 years. There are lots of other important things to focus on, including environmental exposures, immunotherapies as examples, resistance, understanding resistance and how to address resistance in a better way, issues around how to treat fungal asthma and allergic aspergillosis, what is the best approach to that. These are all things that really are important to try to address, and hopefully we can continue to work on some of these. There have been progress in some of these areas, but not so many. We're very grateful to our sponsors, and we've had quite a large number of sponsors for this meeting. We have a slide to demonstrate them, and they're in the book. Those of you, some of them have made it to the meeting to present their information about what products they can offer, and I would encourage you to go and speak to them. It's very important. This meeting wouldn't happen without our sponsors, without doubt. And those of you who have made it, welcome. Thank you all very much for doing so. I do hope you enjoy the meetings. We have probably a reduced number of posters overall. So one of the things we'll do is we have to do a little bit of a reassortment about going to look at your posters. But those of you who have brought posters, be at your poster on the odd and even day so that we can have a good look at it. And then we will be awarding a poster award at the end of all of this. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much.